I invite you now to turn in your in your Bibles, the black ones in the pews. Turn to page 386. The Book of Esther. Now, how many of you know the story of the life of Esther? Anybody? Yeah? A few of you? Oh, I can see it's time for a Purim celebration. So Purim is the holiday where we would have, as good Jews, we would have celebrated the release of our people from the captivity of Persia. Okay? And it's all focused around the book of Esther and the story of Esther. And since I've been here, a few years ago, I preached the book of Esther. Do you remember? And we held up signs. When we said the name Esther, we all said, "Yay!" Remember? And when we said the name Haman, we all said, you do remember, boo and hiss. And if it was good Purim, which by the way will be in March, if it was a good Purim service, we'd have noisemakers and we'd be dressed up in costumes. We would throw candy as we walked down the aisles. It would be a wonderful, raucous kind of celebration of freedom, the freedom from oppression and the rights to live and to worship freely. Well, today our reading is from the 4th chapter of Esther. And it's a part of the book that's really important, but really, you need the whole story. So Esther's mother and father died. By the way, Esther, that's a Persian word that means star. The name she was given when she was born by her mother and her father was Hadassah. It means myrtle, the little myrtle plant, the one that when you crush it between your hands, it releases its fragrance. And in the tradition, probably someone in her family, probably someone they had loved who had died, began with the same letter of her name, Hadassah, because she would be named for someone that was beloved. When her parents die, it's a very dangerous thing not to have family. And so she was taken in by her uncle Mordecai. Now, all of this happened after the Assyrians had come in and taken over all of the northern kingdom and all of the southern kingdom except Jerusalem. You remember about 3 weeks ago? And then the Babylonians came in. And the Babylonians were so fierce, they took over all the land from the Assyrians and they destroyed Jerusalem and they destroyed the great big temple that Solomon had built, remember? And the people were enslaved and they were taken back into the capitals of Babylon, right? Which would now be Iraq. And the capital was Susa. And that's where the story takes place. Because the king, well, his Greek name is Xerxes, but in the text, his name, we call him Ahasuerus. If you read it, it doesn't look like that. Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus was a man who, well, he liked a good party. He had a lot of them. He had a lot of buds that he sort of kept around him, that liked to party. You know how sometimes you do. Just to remind you to keep having a good time. And he liked them. They were his friends. He trusted them. He let them really be in charge of things that as the king he should have been thoughtful of. And one day he had a huge feast that lasted 7 days. Is that not a huge feast? A 7-day feast. And by the 7th day of drinking and laughing and dancing and eating and all manner of amuck, that a king who is seen as a god can get into with his best buddies for 7 days. At the end of those 7 days, one of his buddies said, "I haven't seen your queen, Vashti. I hear she's quite beautiful. And so he says, Vashti, Vashti, you must see my queen, Vashti. She's the most beautiful of all. Send for Vashti. Tell her just to put on her jewels and her crown. And when the word comes to Queen Vashti that she is to come in her jewels and her crown, she declines. Not after 7 days of merrymaking will she parade in front of them. And when she will not come, the king and his friends began to talk about what it's like to have someone you own who will disobey. What will happen if all of the wives decide to disobey? And so Vashti is cut off and she is no longer queen. Well, it made him feel better, I'm sure, for a while. You know, right there in front of all the boys to say that's it for her. But then what are you going to do when you don't have a queen? And so he did what any good God-like king would do. He called for all of the beautiful women in his kingdom to be brought forward. All of the young, beautiful virgin women to come. And they were paraded whether they wanted to come or not. No one asked. It wasn't a question that would have even entered anyone's mind. Why? Or do I have to? And so all of the beautiful women are paraded in front of the king, and one of them is Hadassah. Mordecai tells her she must go, but to keep quiet that she is a Jew because it's dangerous. And so she's paraded in front of the king, and there's something about her. There's something about this woman, Esther. Now they're all taken, the ones he's chosen are all taken into his harem. And for 12 months they're schooled in how to be in the harem of the king. They're taught all manner of things, how to speak, how to look down, when to hold still, how to make the king happy, all the rules of the court. Where you may go and when you may go, where you may not go. You may never speak until the king speaks to you. They're taught all of these rules. And as they are, word goes between Esther and her uncle Mordecai. And they send notes from the head eunuch back and forth to each other. Whispered notes, right? Whispered stories of how are you and how are you well. While all of this is happening, one of the king's great advisors, Haman, who loves being the advisor to the king. In fact, he's pretty sure he's going to be the closest advisor to the king. In fact, one of those party days, he says to the king, put out an edict that when I walk down the street, all of your people have to bow to me. Wouldn't that be fun? And the king says, okay, fine. And so as Haman walks down the street, everyone must bow to Haman, but Mordecai, who is a good Jew, though his temple is destroyed, though his people have nowhere to worship, though they do not always even know how to worship anymore because it's a generation where it has been lost, refuses to bow to Haman. And Haman is furious that anybody, especially a lowly immigrant, would not bow to him. And so he goes back to the king and he tells him that there's a whole group of people, these Jews, who are not following the rules and the laws and the edicts of the king, who are essentially disrespecting the king by not following the king's orders. And so he says to the king, allow me to have them put to death. And the king says, whatever, Haman. And so Haman sends out an edict to all the people. He takes lots, right? We hear about throwing lots in the text lots of times. Some people say they were bones. Some people say they were like we think of dice. And he throws the lots, and it tells him on which day the Jews in all of the territories of Babylon will be put to death. And it's a year later. And so the people have a lot of time to think about the fact that they are going to die, their children are going to die, their grandparents are going to die, their entire people will be wiped from the face of the earth. And so as soon as the edict reaches every village, the Jews go into mourning They put on sackcloth. They wrap themselves in ashes, as we're told in the text, and they go into prayer. Mordecai, who's in the capital, does the same. Now, there's a rule that says when you're wearing ashes as a form of grieving, you can't come into the palace. You can't come into the king's chamber, because the king shouldn't have to see unpleasant sights, even if he causes them. And so Mordecai is outside the king's gate. And when word comes to Esther that her uncle is out there, she sends him fine clothes, and he refuses to change. He says to the eunuch who comes, "Tell her that she has got to go to the king and stand up for her people. She's got to go and beg for us all to live." And when word comes to Esther, she sends word back right there in chapter 4, where we would be if we were reading. She sends word back that says, "Don't you know the law? The law says that no one may go into the king's chamber, may speak to the king unless they are invited. The penalty is certain death." And the word comes back from Mordecai that says, "Whether you go or not, somehow the Jews will be saved. But don't think you will be saved. You and your family will perish. Esther, maybe it's just for this moment that you are born and in this place of dignity as the queen. You must help us." And when Esther gets his message, she sends one back. And she says, "Pray for me. You and everyone, all of our people across the lands, call for a 3-day fast and prayer. I will pray. My ladies will pray. We will be in prayer. And then, God help me, I will go." And 3 days later, Esther, without being called for, enters the palace, enters the room of the king. Now, we don't know whether the guards immediately leapt on her. It's their job to protect the king from those who have not been called. But whatever happened next, we know that the king saw her and waved them away and called for his queen Esther to come forward. And he said to her, "What is it? What would you have?" And she said, "Please, my lord, I wish to invite you and your man, your chancellor Haman, to a banquet that I will present for you." And the king is delighted that his queen has taken this initiative to honor him. And Haman is delighted because he is the only one who has been invited. Just him and the king and the queen. And so they come to her home for a huge banquet. And at the end of the banquet, he says, "My queen, what would you have from me?" And she says, No. I would just feed you again. I would just celebrate you and Haman one more time. Come again tomorrow for a huge banquet, and then I'll tell you what I want. In the meantime, Haman has been reminded of Mordecai, reminded of how he was slighted by Mordecai. In the meantime, the king has gone to bed and he cannot sleep. I'm sure it probably wasn't all that rich food and drinking he'd done with Esther. But he could not sleep, and so he called for the record keeper to come and to read for him. Like you might read from the dictionary, right? It calls for the record keeper to come and read to him what's been happening in his town. And it just so happens that the record keeper opens to the time when, sometime before, when Esther first became queen, when Mordecai overheard people plotting against the king and told Queen Esther, and Esther told the king, and the king was able to have them killed, and he was safe. And that's what the record keeper began to read. And as he read it, the king said, Mordecai, did we ever do anything for this man?" And the record keeper said, "No, my lord." And he said, "Oh, we must do something. We must do something." And so the next morning when Haman came in to see what the king would have him do, he said, "Haman, what would you do for someone that you wanted to honor in a great way, someone that you owed so much to, that you really wanted to do something special for them?" And Haman said, "Oh, I knew he would see my true worth." He said, well, my king, I might put your own crown on his head. I might put your robe around his shoulders. I might even go so far as to put him on your horse and have someone lead him through the streets so everyone can see that he is your favorite and that you are honoring him. And the king said, oh, it's a wonderful idea, wonderful idea. Do that for Mordecai, and you can lead the horse. And so Haman had a gallows built for Mordecai in the center of the palace, 75 feet tall, because he was determined to have him put to death. That night when they came to the second of Queen Esther's banquets, they ate and they drank as before. No wonder the kings often had gout. They ate and they drank as they had before. And this time in the evening when the king said, my queen, what would you have? Up to half of my kingdom is yours. What would you have from me? And she said, my lord, I am a Jew. And it has been decreed that all of us, all of my people are to be slain. My lord, your queen, who adores you and makes feasts for you, is to die. And he said, who would have such gall? Who would threaten my queen? She said, Haman, my lord. Haman. Haman has built a gallows for Mordecai, who saved your life. Haman has sent out a decree that we will all die. Now, Haman was just sort of slipping out the door when the king said, take him. He will be on the gallows, my queen. Don't worry about your people. And so Haman was taken to the gallows, and Queen Esther and Mordecai became an advisor to the king. And all of the Jewish people were saved from the hands of the Persian king. And it's a wonderful tale that's written as a piece of theater. In fact, the rabbi said, oh, don't put that in there. It doesn't even talk about God. But the people loved the story of the underdog, the one who had no voice, the one who had no rights, an orphan woman immigrant who was big enough to use her voice to save her people. And when Martin Luther read it, he said, oh, don't put that in the canon. It's got no talk of God, but it's in the Hebrew text. We'll have to keep it. But it's a story that the people love. So you might say to me, yeah, it's a really good story, Pam, but why are we hearing it in Advent? Why are we hearing a story about waiting, about longing, about fear, about desiring freedom, about wanting God to save us and be with us, about needing a moment of hope when it looks like there can be no hope? Why do we have a story about Esther, a woman who stands up and speaks truth to power? Maybe to remind us that it's our time to do the same. That all of us are called during this Advent season when we're waiting for the coming of the Messiah again. That until the Messiah comes, it is our job to stand up and speak truth to power, to save the immigrant, the lonely, the outcast, to save the oppressed. It is our job to be the hands and feet until Christ comes again. You gotta give it to Esther, Hadassah, Mordecai, and Purim. It's something worth celebrating. May we all celebrate it in our own lives this week. May we all be Esther. Find some truth. Speak it to power. Amen.
So